In 1894, a demolition worker named Frank Bellew stood in the ruins of what newspapers called the greatest architectural achievement in American history, the White City, the world's Columbian Exposition. Over 200 gleaming buildings that had allegedly been designed, constructed and finished in just 2 years. But as Bellew's wrecking crew tore into the structures, something didn't add up. These buildings weren't made of the materials the official reports claimed. The carved stone wasn't plaster. The foundations weren't temporary. And when Bellew tried to tell people what he'd found, his testimony vanished from the historical record. Until now. If you want to understand how cities were really built in the 1800s, how to spot inconsistencies in architectural timelines, and why certain historical narratives don't match the physical evidence, hit subscribe. I cover suppressed history, architectural anomalies, and timeline discrepancies every week. The official story is straightforward. In 1890, Chicago won the bid to host the 1893 World's Fair, celebrating the 400th anniversary of Columbus reaching the Americas. Architect Daniel Burnham was put in charge. He had 2 years to transform 600 acres of Jackson Park into a city of white neoclassical palaces. The manufacturers building alone covered 30 acres under one roof, the largest building in the world at that time. The administration building rose 275 feet with a golden dome. The Palace of Fine Arts featured massive Corinthian columns. The machinery hall stretched over 850 feet, all built in 24 months, all temporary, all meant to be demolished after the fair closed. The scale was staggering. 14 main exhibition palaces, state pavilions for all 44 states, foreign nation buildings, specialized halls for transportation, electricity, mining, and fisheries. The Midway Plaisance contained 65 separate structures, including the first Ferris wheel. Over 200 buildings total, all allegedly built between early 1891 and May 1893. For context, the Brooklyn Bridge took 14 years. The 1893 fair was an entire city built in less than 2 years with 1890s technology. The fair opened May 1st, 1893. President Grover Cleveland pushed a button, sending electrical current through the grounds, starting pumps and fountains simultaneously. Over 6 months, 27 million people visited. They saw the first Ferris wheel standing 264 feet tall. They watched electric lights illuminate entire city blocks. They ate Cracker Jack and juicy fruit gum for the first time. They saw the first moving walkway. Everything was pristine. Everything was white. Everything was magnificent. Then October 30th, 1893, the fair closed. Within days, demolition contracts were awarded. The city wanted the fairgrounds cleared quickly. That's when Frank Bellew entered the picture. Bellew worked for Ryan Wrecking Company, one of the largest demolition firms in the Midwest. He was 34 years old, a veteran with 16 years in construction. His crew had demolished factories, warehouses, hotels, and mansions across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. He knew construction materials like a surgeon knows anatomy. He could identify wood grain, concrete composition, and plaster types by touch. He could tell if brick was fired locally or shipped from the East Coast, which is why what he found at the White City made no sense. The official report stated buildings were made of staff, a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber sprayed over wooden frames, cheap, fast, temporary, perfect for structures lasting 6 months. Workers could allegedly erect entire palaces in weeks, spray the staff mixture, shape it into columns and statuary, paint it white, instant neoclassical grandeur. The technique was documented in architectural journals. Nothing mysterious about it. But when Bellew's crew started tearing into the manufacturer's building in January 1894, they didn't find wooden frames covered in plaster. They found solid masonry. Stone foundations going down 15 feet. Brick walls 3 feet thick. Concrete reinforcement requiring massive infrastructure. Load-bearing pillars made of fitted stone blocks, not hollow wooden forms. Construction that takes years, not months. Bellew documented everything in letters to his younger brother William in Boston. Those letters survived because William kept them in a steamer trunk discovered in 1952 during an estate clearance. By then, Frank had been dead 40 years. His testimony had never entered any official record. In a letter dated February 14th, 1894, Bellew wrote this: "We expected to finish the manufacturers building in 3 weeks based on staff construction. We are entering our 8th week and have cleared only 1/4. The material is not plaster. It is limestone block and poured concrete. The columns are not hollow wooden frames. They are solid carved stone with details that would take a master craftsman months to complete. Each column. There are hundreds," he continued. "The foreman keeps telling us to work faster, that we're behind schedule and losing money, but you cannot tear down a fortress with tools meant for theatre sets. We've had to bring in steam-powered equipment. We've drilled into foundations deeper than any temporary structure would require. This building was not constructed in 1891. I would stake my career on it." Other workers noticed too. A crew on the transportation building reported oxidation patterns on metal fixtures suggesting decades of weathering, not 2 years. Another team at the electricity building discovered maintenance tunnels underneath, brick-lined and properly ventilated, connected to a larger network. This infrastructure requires months of excavation and engineering. No records exist of such works during the official construction period. The timeline was already suspicious. Daniel Burnham had 2 years to build the White City. But Chicago in 1891 didn't have infrastructure for a project this scale. The city had just recovered from the Great Fire of 1871. Labour was scarce. Building materials were expensive. Transportation networks were limited. Yet Burnham assembled 10,000 workers, sourced millions of board feet of lumber, fabricated thousands of tons of metal framework, and coordinated the largest construction project in American history. The Empire State Building took 13 months with 1930s technology, steel engineering, electric tools, and modern management. One building. Burnham allegedly built over 200 buildings, landscaped 600 acres, installed underground utilities, created artificial lagoons, and finished every interior for the May 1893 opening with 1890s technology. Let's examine one building. The manufacturers building covered 30.7 acres, that's 1,492 square feet. The building was 787 feet wide and weighed 687 feet long. Roof supported by iron trusses spanning the width without interior columns. Each truss weighed over 60 tons, fabricated off-site, transported, lifted into place. There were dozens. The building also featured a second-level gallery adding 750,000 square feet of exhibition space. If the official timeline is correct, this building was designed, engineered, fabricated, erected and finished in approximately 16 months. That means workers completed roughly 83,000 square feet per day. Modern construction crews complete 5,000 to 10,000 square feet daily under ideal conditions with power tools, prefabricated components, mechanical equipment. The 1893 crews needed to work 10 to 15 times faster. Without electric tools, without modern lifting equipment, without prefabrication. Multiply that across 200 buildings. The mathematical improbability becomes clear. But the buildings were there. Millions saw them. Thousands of photographs documented them. So either the timeline is wrong, or the buildings weren't built from scratch. This is where the alternative theory comes in. The Tartaria hypothesis suggests these buildings already existed. Remnants of a previous civilization or construction phase deliberately erased from history. The theory points to identical neoclassical architecture appearing worldwide during the same period. Chicago, Paris, St. Petersburg, San Francisco, Melbourne. All looking like they came from the same master plan. The theory asks why so many cities were allegedly building identical grand structures in the late 1800s, only to tear most down within decades. Why build over 200 monumental buildings just to demolish them 8 months later? Whether you accept Tartaria or not, legitimate questions remain about the 1893 fair that historians haven't adequately answered. Why was demolition rushed? The fair closed October 1893. By February 1894, demolition was underway. By August, most major buildings were gone. Why the urgency? Why were structurally sound buildings destroyed when they could be repurposed? The Palace of Fine Arts remained standing until 1930. That's 37 years. If one building lasted 4 decades, why couldn't others? Chicago was growing and needed public buildings. yet nearly everything was systematically torn down. The official answer is economics. Maintaining buildings would be expensive. They were designed as temporary. The land needed to return to parkland. Fire insurance would be prohibitive. These are reasonable explanations. But Bellow's letters suggest another reason connected to what the buildings were actually made of. Bellew wrote that demolition contracts included unusual clauses he'd never encountered in 16 years. Normally, demolition companies profit from salvaging materials, bricks cleaned and sold, lumber milled and reused, metal melted and recast, decorative elements sold to salvage dealers, stone repurposed. Standard practice, how demolition companies stayed profitable. But at the White City, contracts specified materials be destroyed rather than salvaged, carved stone broken into rubble too small to reuse, architectural details rendered unrecognizable, decorative metalwork cut into scrap, nothing preserved intact. Nothing could leave the site in a form allowing someone to study it later. In March 1894, Bellew described what happened to the administration building interior. They had us tear out marble staircases first, beautiful work, solid marble, veined and polished. We were told to sledgehammer them into pieces no larger than a fist. Same with the rotunda columns. We didn't dismantle them for reuse. We destroyed them where they stood. It felt like vandalism. I asked the supervisor why we couldn't salvage the materials. He said those were the contract terms, everything demolished to foundation level and carted away. This wasn't standard practice. Demolition companies survived on salvage. Contracts prohibiting salvage meant charging much higher labour fees. Someone was paying extra to ensure materials from the White City were completely destroyed rather than reused. Who? Why? These questions were never addressed. Bellew became increasingly disturbed as demolition progressed. In April 1894, he described finding evidence contradicting everything the public had been told. We broke through a wall in the manufacturers' building eastern wing. Behind the staff overlay, we found brick masonry that had been whitewashed over. The bricks bore maker's marks from a Milwaukee kiln that stopped operating in 1878. These bricks were at minimum 16 years old when the fair opened. The mortar showed weathering consistent with decade-old construction, not fresh mortar from work completed 2 years prior. He described structural details making no sense for temporary construction. The floor joists are old-growth timber, white oak cut from trees that would have been 200 years old when felled. This is premium construction material, not lumber you use for temporary buildings. The nails showed rust patterns suggesting they had been in place for many years, not the bright metal you see in recent construction. The systematic destruction extended to records. Most original construction documents for the fair have been lost or destroyed. Architectural plans, material manifests, worker payrolls, daily progress reports, the kinds of records normally preserved for significant projects. Records that survive are surprisingly sparse. We have some drawings showing layouts and elevations, some photographs of construction in progress, newspaper accounts and official reports. But detailed day-to-day documentation that would verify exactly how buildings were constructed, how long each phase took, where materials were sourced, this documentation is largely missing. If the official story is true, if buildings really were built in 2 years using standard methods and temporary materials, why hide the documentation? Wouldn't you preserve every detail of this incredible achievement for future architects to study? The fact that documentation was lost while promotional materials survived suggests a pattern. We have plenty of records showing what buildings looked like and how impressive they were. Very few showing exactly how they were built. Bellew noticed something else during demolition. Evidence of previous modifications. Patches where newer materials covered older work. Doors walled up with different brick than surrounding walls. Windows cut into existing walls with saw marks and plaster repairs visible. Interior spaces not matching official floor plans, staircases leading to doors opening onto blank walls suggesting previous layouts that had been altered. In one section of the mines building, Bellew's crew uncovered a cornerstone plastered over and painted to match the surrounding wall. When they cleaned off the plaster, the date carved into the stone read 1860, 26 years before the fair opened. The cornerstone was granite, precisely cut and carved with professional lettering. Not decorative, functional, set into the foundation as part of load-bearing structure. Bellew sent that cornerstone to William with an urgent letter. This was buried under 3 layers of plaster on an exterior foundation wall. If this building was constructed in 1891 or 1892, why does it have a cornerstone dated 1867? I confronted the site engineer. He said it must have been salvaged and reused. But you don't reuse foundation stones in temporary construction. You especially don't plaster over them and hide them. This cornerstone is structural, load-bearing. Someone went to considerable effort to hide it before the fair opened. The cornerstone disappeared between 1894 and 1952. William kept the letter, but the stone vanished. Lost, stolen, or deliberately removed, no one knows. Bellew's observations were never investigated. His questions never answered. By June 1894, just 8 months after closing, most major buildings were gone. The manufacturers building was rubble. The transportation building reduced to a filled foundation pit. The electricity building torn apart and materials destroyed per contract. Within 8 months the White City was erased, but photographs remained, and studying them reveals details inconsistent with temporary construction. Look at weathering patterns on buildings. Staff plaster doesn't weather. It's not designed to last long enough to develop patina or oxidation, yet photographs show water staining from window frames, moss growth on northern exposures, settling cracks suggesting years of exposure, weathering patterns you see on buildings standing a decade or more, not structures finished months before photographs were taken. Examine the photographs more closely and other anomalies emerge. Mortar joints show different aging patterns. Some sections appear fresh, while others show darkening from multiple weather cycles. If the entire building was constructed in 1891 and 1892, the mortar should show uniform aging. The photographs reveal patchwork patterns suggesting repairs at different times. Roof lines show subtle sagging, the kind of settlement occurring over years as timber dries and foundations shift. The window glass shows waviness and imperfections consistent with older 1860s and 1870s manufacturing techniques, not the flatter, clearer glass available by the 1890s. Look at landscaping. The official story claims workers transplanted mature trees to create instant parkland. But transplanting mature trees is extremely difficult, even with modern equipment. Large trees have root systems extending as far as the canopy spreads. Successfully transplanting requires excavating root balls weighing several tons, transporting without damage, preparing properly sized planting holes, monitoring for years. Low success rate, high cost, staggering logistics for hundreds of trees across 600 acres. Yet photographs show trees with trunk diameters taking 30 to 40 years to develop, oaks with massive spreading canopies, elms with characteristic vase shapes taking decades to form. The ground around these trees shows settled earth with established ground cover, not disturbed soil from recent transplanting. Either fair organisers somehow transported and planted enormous mature trees using technology that wouldn't be refined until the mid-20th century, or those trees were already there. Look at infrastructure. The fair had comprehensive underground utilities rivaling major American cities, complete sewer systems with brick-lined tunnels, water mains supplying hundreds of thousands of gallons daily, electrical conduits underground, steam heating pipes, gas lines, sophisticated civil engineering requiring extensive excavation, careful planning, precise execution, time for concrete to cure. More advanced than most of Chicago itself in 1893. No contemporary accounts describe this massive underground construction work between 1891 and 1893. No photographs show trenches, pipe storage, utility crews. No newspaper articles marvel at installation speed. It's as if utilities were simply there when needed. These inconsistencies have been explained as American ingenuity and determination. The narrative is that Burnham accomplished the impossible through will, planning, unlimited resources, and can-do spirit. Maybe true. Maybe they built a wonder in 2 years. Maybe every timeline challenge has reasonable explanation. But Bellu's letters suggest we should question. We should ask whether physical evidence matches what we've been told. Wonder why someone paid extra to destroy salvage materials. Be curious about missing documentation. Think critically about whether the timeline makes sense given technological constraints. After demolition, Bellew tried going public. He approached Chicago newspapers. The Tribune declined. The Herald said they weren't interested in old fair news. The Inter-Ocean told him questioning construction timelines would be seen as unpatriotic. None published his account. He contacted architectural journals that had covered construction extensively. The Inland Architect, American Architect, and Building News, Engineering News. When Bellew wrote describing what he'd found, none responded. He wrote directly to Daniel Burnham, respectful and professional, explained his background, described discrepancies, asked for clarification, requested a meeting. Burnham never responded. In November 1894, Bellew wrote his final letter to William, defeated. No one wants to hear that the greatest achievement in American architecture might not be what we were told. The fair is over. The buildings are gone. The story has been written. My testimony would only create confusion and controversy. I am letting this matter rest. But keep these letters. Someday someone might want to know the truth about what those buildings were really made of. That truth remained hidden 58 years in William's trunk. When discovered in 1952, the letters were donated to the Chicago Historical Society, catalogued but never highlighted. They sat in storage until 1987 when graduate student Margaret Chen found them researching labor conditions during the exposition. Dr. Chen recognized potential evidence of major historical discrepancy. She tried publishing a paper about Bellew's observations. The Journal of American History, American Historical Review, and Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era all rejected it. Reviewers said Bellew's testimony was anecdotal and couldn't be verified without physical evidence. Accepting his account would require rejecting vast established documentation. Dr. Chen argued the absence of physical evidence was itself suspicious. Why were materials destroyed? Why were records incomplete? Why such resistance to examining inconsistencies? She spent 3 more years digging through archives. She found invoice records from an Indiana limestone quarry showing deliveries to Jackson Park in 1889, 2 years before official construction began. She discovered unpublished photographs showing Jackson Park in 1890 with existing structures partially obscured by trees. She interviewed descendants of workers who recalled their grandfathers making comments about buildings being older than officially stated. But these pieces of evidence, while suggestive, couldn't satisfy academic peer reviewers demanding conclusive proof. Frustrated, Dr. Chen self-published a booklet in 1993, exactly 100 years after the exposition. The Buildings That Weren't Built, one worker's account of the 1893 demolition. She printed 500 copies, sold 247. One regional journal called it interesting but ultimately unpersuasive. Most historians ignored it, but questions didn't go away. Independent researchers kept finding anomalies, photographs showing architectural details inconsistent with staff construction, survivor accounts mentioning solid stone where there should be plaster, engineering analysis suggesting structural capacity far exceeding what temporary frameworks could support. In 2003, Northwestern University researchers used ground-penetrating radar surveying Jackson Park for geological study. They found extensive buried foundations far more substantial than temporary buildings require. Deep stone pilings extending 20 feet below grade, interconnected basement systems, evidence of construction techniques matching 1860s and 1870s engineering, not 1890s methods. They published findings in the Journal of Applied Geophysics in 2004. Technical paper focused on survey methodology. Mentioned the fair only in passing, noting foundation remains appeared to predate the fair or showed characteristics inconsistent with temporary buildings. Because it was published in a geology journal rather than history journal, most historians never saw it. The Tartaria theory has woven these pieces together: Bellieu's letters, Chen's research, the radar survey, photographic anomalies, timeline inconsistencies. Some proponents make claims difficult to defend, but at its core the theory asks a straightforward question. If advanced architectural achievements existed that don't fit our understanding of technological development and historical timelines, how would we recognize that? How would we know if the historical record had been altered? You don't need to embrace full Tartaria to acknowledge something strange happened. The construction timeline is questionable. Demolition was unusual. Documentation is suspiciously incomplete. Bellieu's testimony raises specific questions never properly addressed. What makes this significant is we're not discussing ancient history. This happened in 1893 in Chicago. Thousands of photographs, extensive newspaper archives, survivor accounts from 27 million visitors. This is modern, documented, verifiable history. If the official story about something this recent doesn't hold up under scrutiny, what does that tell us about historical narratives from earlier periods with less evidence? The revisionist economic history angle adds another layer. The late 1800s saw unprecedented wealth concentration. Robber barons controlled vast resources and had enormous influence over what got built, preserved, recorded, and forgotten. If buildings at the 1893 fair were remnants from earlier construction, acknowledging that would undermine narratives of American progress and Chicago's resurrection from the Great Fire. Powerful incentives existed to control that story. From Burnham's perspective, the fair made him legendary. Known as the man who built the White City in 2 years, that reputation led to commissions for the Flatiron Building, Union Station, his plan of Chicago. His career trajectory was built on the story of what he accomplished. Admitting he renovated and repurposed existing structures would have destroyed that reputation. He had every reason to maintain the official narrative, and Burnham wasn't alone in having stakes in the story. The contractors, architects, and engineers who worked on the fair had built their reputations on this achievement. If the truth emerged that buildings had not been constructed from scratch in 2 years, their credentials would be questioned. The financial investors who backed the fair also had reasons to suppress questions. The promised return on investment was predicated on the fair being a showcase of innovation. If it became known the achievement was less impressive than advertised, the fair's legacy would be diminished, affecting everything from bond valuations to future civic projects. From Chicago's perspective, the fair proved resurrection and progress. Devastated by the Great Fire in 1871, the exposition demonstrated Chicago had surpassed former glory and become world-class. That narrative attracted investment, immigration, prestige. Any suggestion fairgrounds buildings existed before would undermine that valuable story. Officials and business leaders had incentives to promote and protect it. For newspaper editors and historians, there was pressure to tell the inspiring story celebrating American achievement. Questions about timeline inconsistencies would be seen as unpatriotic nitpicking. The buildings were magnificent. The fair was successful. Why complicate that story? So Bellieu's letters got filed away. The 1867 cornerstone disappeared. Photographs showing weathering got explained as lighting tricks. Underground utilities got credited to exceptional engineering. Radar findings got buried in a geology journal. The official story became the only story most people heard. Until independent researchers started asking questions. Until people like Dr. Chen refused to accept dismissive explanations. Until technology like radar revealed what was buried beneath the surface. Until enough people connected patterns between the 1893 fair and similar projects in other cities. We may never know with certainty what those buildings were made of, or when they were constructed. Too much evidence destroyed, too much time passed, but we can ask better questions. Demand more rigorous analysis, stop dismissing anomalies as coincidences, and examine them as potential clues. Frank Bellew spent 8 months tearing down buildings that, by his professional assessment, weren't supposed to exist as he found them. He tried telling the truth. The world in 1894 wasn't ready to listen. The world in 1952 still wasn't ready. Maybe now, over 130 years later, we're finally ready to consider he might have been right. That physical evidence matters more than official reports, that questions about timeline and materials aren't attacks on American achievement, but legitimate inquiry deserving investigation. Next time you see photographs of the 1893 exposition, the white buildings reflected in lagoons, crowds in Victorian dress, the Ferris wheel rising above, look closely. Ask yourself if carved stone that detailed could be plaster moulded in weeks. Ask if that much construction could happen in 2 years with 1890s methods. Ask if temporary buildings needed stone pilings going down 15 feet. Ask if those trees are recently transplanted or decades-old established growth. And remember Frank Bellew, who knew the difference between plaster and limestone, who tried telling people what he'd found, whose testimony was buried because it contradicted a story people wanted to believe. If this suppressed architectural history interests you, I've covered similar anomalies at other expositions. The 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco had suspicious demolition and material discrepancies. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis featured buildings workers claimed showed evidence of previous use. The patterns are consistent. The questions keep accumulating. Click the video on screen to continue investigating. I'll see you there.